Our second story is called Mr. Strong and the Ogre, written by the same artists. Mr. Strong is the strongest person in the world. He's so strong he can balance an elephant on one finger. But quite recently, it looked as though Mr. Strong might have met his match. One day Mr. Strong let Miss Tiny on his way home from the shops. Miss Tiny was crying. "Whatever is the matter?" asked Mr. Strong. Miss Tiny told him she had been walking back to her house, carrying a lollipop over her shoulder, and a huge, ugly ogre had leapt out from behind a bush blocking her path. "Give me your lollipop," the ogre had demanded. Poor Miss Tiny had no choice but to give the ogre her lollipop. Mr. Strong was appalled. It is not far to my house," he said. "I'll make you a cup of tea, and we can work out what is to be done." With Miss Tiny sitting on his shoulder, Mr. Strong continued on his way. Just around the corner, they came upon Mr. Rush, sitting on the side of the road, looking very shaken. "Whatever is wrong?" asked Mr. Strong. Mr. Rush explained. He had been driving along the road when an enormous brute of an ogre had loomed up in the middle of the lane. "Give me your car," the ogre had demanded. Poor Mr. Rush had no choice but to hand over his car and watch helplessly as the ogre drove it away in it. Mr. Strong suggested that Mr. Rush joined him and Miss Tiny for tea. They had walked the last half a mile to Mr. Strong's house when they met a very upset and indignant Mr. Uppity. This time Mr. Strong had a very good idea what the matter was. Mr. Uppity had been on his way to the bank to count his money when a huge horrible ogre had stepped out from behind a tree, forcing Mr. Uppity to stop. "Give me your hat," the ogre had roared. Poor Mr. Uppity had no choice but to give the ogre his hat, which, not surprisingly, was far too small for the ogre. "I've heard enough," announced Mr. Strong. "Go inside and make yourself some tea. I'm off to find this ogre. I shan't be long." Mr. Strong had a pretty good idea where he might find the ogre. Behind his garden, on the other side of the hill, there was a cave in the woods. Sure enough, this was where Mr. Strong found the ogre, lounging at the entrance to the cave, eating Miss Tiny's lollipop. The only trouble was that there was not one ogre, but three. They were brothers. The ogres slowly raised themselves to their full, menacing height. Undaunted, Mr. Strong marched up to the ogres and introduced himself. "Strong, you don't know the meaning of strong. Just look at you," mocked the biggest ogre. "If I prove I am stronger than the three of you, will you apologize to my friends and promise to stop bullying?" asked Mr. Strong. "Stronger than the three of us?" boomed the biggest ogre. "Even my little brother is stronger than you." "Can he lift this?" asked Mr. Strong, raising a large rock above his head. "Easy peasy," said the smallest ogre. Mr. Strong passed the largest rock to the smallest ogre, but it was too heavy for him, and the ogre dropped it on his toe. "Ow!" he bellowed in pain. "Out of the way, Titch," snarled the middle ogre, pushing the youngest ogre out of his way. "I bet you too weak to pick that up," he taunted, pointing at a huge slab of stone. Mr. Strong smiled and lifted it effortlessly. "Your turn," said Mr. Strong. The middle ogre tried with all his might to lift the slab of stone. He raised one end 3 inches off the ground before he dropped it, trapping his fingers underneath. "Ow!" roared the middle ogre in pain. "Let me have a go," thundered the third ogre, who was possibly the least clever of the three, but by far the largest. With one enormous effort, the biggest ogre lifted the stone slab above his head. "Beat that," he grunted through gritted teeth. But then his knees began to wobble, his legs started to tremble, His arms buckled and the rock came down on his head, knocking him out cold. Mr. Strong picked up the biggest ogre as if he weighed more than a feather and carried him, with the other two brothers following behind, over the hill back to his house, where he set him down in front of his 3 friends. "Now we have got all that nonsense out of the way," said Mr. Strong. "I think it's time you said sorry." "We're sorry," mumbled the 3 ogres in unison. "We can't hear you," said Mr. Strong. "We're very sorry," said the ogre brothers more clearly. "Now that's done, we can all have some tea," announced Mr. Strong, which they did, although the ogres did not stay long, as tea parties are not really their thing. Time for story 3.